The Apache girl was dragged through town by her hair until the lonely rancher threw down his badge. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, casting long shadows between the weathered wooden buildings that lined the main thoroughfare. Sheriff Tom Mason adjusted his hat brim lower over his eyes, trying to block out more than just the glaring light. At 42, he'd worn the badge for nearly 15 years, and each passing day seemed to weigh heavier on his shoulders than the last. The sound of jeering voices and shuffling feet drew his attention toward the far end of town. A crowd was gathering near the general store, their voices carrying an ugly tone that made Tom's stomach churn. He'd heard that sound before, the collective voice of a mob seeking blood, seeking someone to blame for their frustrations and fears. As he approached, the scene unfolded before him like a nightmare. 3 men had surrounded a young Apache woman, no more than 20 years old, her traditional dress torn and dirty from being forced to walk miles through the desert. Her long black hair was tangled in the grip of Jake Morrison, the town's self-appointed leader of vigilante justice. Jake was a large man with cruel eyes and hands that had never known honest work, preferring to live off the fear he instilled in others. "Look what we found skulking around the Henderson Ranch," Jake announced to the growing crowd. "Little Apache spy, probably counting our cattle for her savage friends." The young woman's dark eyes blazed with defiance despite her precarious situation. She held her head high, refusing to show the fear that Tom could see flickering behind her brave facade. Blood trickled from a cut on her lip, and her wrists bore the red marks of rough rope. "She ain't talking," said Pete Harris, Jake's constant companion, and a man whose intelligence was as limited as his compassion. "Maybe we need to loosen her tongue the old-fashioned way." Tom felt his hand instinctively move toward his gun, but he stopped himself. The crowd numbered at least 20 people now, including several women and children who watched with a mixture of curiosity and bloodlust. These were his people, the citizens he'd sworn to protect. But protect from what? From whom? "Found her with this?" Jake held up a small leather pouch. "Filled with our soil, taking it back to her people, no doubt, to help them plan their next raid." Tom knew it was likely medicinal herbs or sacred earth, common among the Apache for spiritual purposes. But explaining that to this crowd would be like trying to reason with a pack of wolves. The recent Apache raids on nearby settlements had everyone on edge, and fear had a way of turning ordinary people into monsters. "Please." The young woman spoke for the first time, her English clear despite a slight accent. "I am not your enemy. I came seeking medicine for my sick brother." Her words only seemed to inflame the crowd further. "Medicine?" Jake spat. "Poison, more likely. Or information about our defenses." Tom watched as Jake began dragging the woman by her hair toward the center of town, her feet struggling to find purchase on the dusty ground. The crowd followed like vultures, their voices rising in approval. Some called for her to be tied to a horse and dragged through the desert. Others suggested more immediate and violent solutions. The sheriff felt something die inside him as he watched the scene unfold. He'd taken this job to protect the innocent, to uphold justice in a lawless land. But somewhere along the way, he'd become complicit in the very brutality he'd once fought against. How many times had he looked the other way when the townsfolk took justice into their own hands? How many times had he told himself it was necessary, that these were hard times requiring hard choices? As the crowd reached the town square, Jake threw the young woman to the ground near the old oak tree that had seen too many dark deeds. "String her up!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Make an example of her." Tom's hand trembled as it rested on his gun. His late wife Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, words she'd spoken during their last conversation before the fever took her. "A man's character isn't measured by the badge he wears, Tom. It's measured by what he does when no one's watching, when it's hard to do what's right." The crowd was working itself into a frenzy now, and Tom knew he had only moments before the situation turned irreversibly violent. He thought of his empty house on the edge of town, of the bottle of whiskey that had become his only companion in recent months, of the dreams where Sarah looked at him with disappointment in her eyes. Jake was fashioning a noose now, his movements deliberate and practiced. The young Apache woman knelt in the dust, her lips moving in what Tom assumed was prayer. Her dignity in the face of such hatred was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The moment of truth had arrived. Tom Mason could continue to be the sheriff who kept the peace by allowing injustice, or he could remember why he'd pinned on the badge in the first place. Will Sheriff Mason find the courage to stand against his own town? Will this innocent Apache woman become another victim of frontier justice? The answer will shock you, but you'll have to subscribe to see what happens next. Hit that subscribe button now, because this story is about to take a turn that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about heroes and villains in the Old West. Tom Mason's boots echoed against the wooden planks of the general store porch as he stepped forward, his shadow falling across the dusty square where the crowd had gathered. The weight of his Colt .45 felt different now. Not like the burden it had become, but like the tool of justice it was meant to be. "That's enough," he called out, his voice carrying the authority that had once made him respected throughout the territory. Jake Morrison looked up from his rope work, a sneer twisting his weathered features. "Well, well, Sheriff finally decided to join us. Come to watch the show, Tom?" I said, "That's enough." Tom's voice was steady, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. He counted the faces in the crowd. 23 adults, half a dozen children, people he'd shared meals with, whose hands he'd shaken at church socials, whose problems he'd helped solve when they came to his office seeking help. "Now hold on there, Sheriff," said Pete Harris, still gripping the young woman's arm. "This here's a dangerous Apache. Could be a scout for war parties. We're just protecting our families." Tom looked down at the woman kneeling in the dust. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 18 or 19. Her traditional dress was beautifully made, with intricate beadwork that spoke of careful hands and cultural pride. This was no warrior or scout. This was someone's daughter, someone's sister. "Let her go, Pete," Tom said quietly. The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't how things usually went. Usually, the sheriff would make a show of official procedure, maybe suggest they hold her in jail until the circuit judge came through in a month or two. By then, of course, the problem would have resolved itself one way or another. "You feeling all right, Tom?" Jake asked, his voice carrying a mocking tone. "Maybe you've been spending too much time with that bottle of yours. This here's justice we're talking about. Protection of our homes and families." Tom felt the familiar anger rise in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to the bottle after Sarah's death. But this time, instead of drowning it in whiskey, he channeled it into something useful. "I said let her go." "Or what?" Jake's hand moved to his own gun. "You gonna shoot your own people to protect some Apache savage?" The word savage hung in the air like a poison cloud. Tom had heard it so many times it had lost its meaning, become just another word used to justify the unjustifiable. But looking at the young woman's face, seeing the intelligence in her eyes, the dignity in her bearing despite her circumstances, the word felt like a slap. "Her name," Tom said, looking directly at the woman, "is what?" She met his gaze steadily. "Ayana," she said quietly, "and it means eternal blossoms in my language." "Ayana," Tom repeated, and something in the way he said it made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. It was harder to hate someone when you knew their name, when you recognized their humanity. "This is touching and all," Jake said, "but we got a job to do here. This Apache—" "This young woman," Tom interrupted, "is under the protection of the law, my law." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, stepped forward. "Tom, you know what they did to the Morrison Ranch last month. 5 good men dead. We can't take chances." Tom knew the Morrison Ranch incident well. It had been a retaliatory raid after Jake's cousin had shot 2 Apache men who were trying to trade for medical supplies. The cycle of violence had been spinning for months, each side justifying their actions by pointing to the other's crimes. "Mrs. Henderson?" Tom said respectfully. "I understand your fear, but this woman wasn't at the Morrison ranch. She's here seeking medicine for her sick brother." "Says who?" Pete demanded. "Says her. You gonna take the word of an Apache over your own people?" Tom looked around at the faces surrounding him. These were people he'd known for years, people who'd welcomed him into their community when he'd first arrived with his young bride. But fear had changed them, twisted them into something ugly. Fear of the unknown, fear of the other, fear of anything that challenged their simple view of the world. "I'm going to take the word of the evidence," Tom said. He walked over to where Jake had dropped Ayana's leather pouch and picked it up. Opening it, he showed the contents to the crowd. Healing herbs, sage, dried berries. "This is medicine, not weapons. Could be poison," someone called out from the back. Tom sighed. There was no reasoning with mob mentality. Fear and hatred had taken root too deeply. He looked at Ayana, still kneeling in the dust, and made his decision. "Miss Ayana," he said formally, "I'm placing you under my protection. Pete, let her go." "The hell I will," Pete snarled. In one fluid motion, Tom drew his gun. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoed across the suddenly silent square. "I won't ask again." The crowd froze. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the buildings and the distant lowing of cattle. Tom kept his gun trained on Pete, but his eyes swept the crowd, making sure everyone understood the situation. "You're pointing a gun at your own people," Jake said, his voice filled with disbelief. "For her. I'm pointing a gun at anyone who would harm an innocent person," Tom replied. "Badge or no badge, that's who I am." Pete slowly released Ayana's arm. She rubbed her wrists where the rope had bitten into her skin, but didn't speak. Tom could see the wheels turning in Jake's head, calculating odds, weighing options. "This ain't over, Tom," Jake said finally. "And not by a long shot." The jail cell door clanged shut with a finality that seemed to echo through Tom's bones. He'd escorted Ayana to safety, but both of them knew it was temporary at best. The small building that served as Copper Ridge's jail and sheriff's office felt more like a fortress under siege than a place of law and order. Ayana sat on the narrow cot, examining her scraped wrists in the dim light filtering through the barred window. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the town square, but her dark eyes followed Tom's every movement as he paced the small office area just outside her cell. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. Tom stopped pacing and looked at her. "Yes, I did. They are your people. I am nothing to you." The simple statement hit Tom harder than any physical blow. He pulled a chair close to the cell bars and sat down heavily. "Gee, that's where you're wrong, Miss Ayana. Every person in this territory is my responsibility. That's what the badge means, or what it's supposed to mean." She studied his face carefully. "But you have not always believed this, have you, Sheriff?" Her perceptiveness caught him off guard. Tom found himself thinking of Sarah again, of the man he'd been when she was alive. "No," he admitted, "I haven't always lived up to what I believed." Through the window, they could hear voices in the street. The crowd had dispersed, but Tom knew they were regrouping. Jake Morrison wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and the townspeople's fear wouldn't simply evaporate because the sheriff had intervened. "Tell me about your brother," Tom said, wanting to change the subject from his own failures. Ayana's expression softened. "His name is Nalnish. He's 2 years younger than me, but he has always been the brave one. Last winter, he was hurt in a hunting accident. A bear attacked our hunting party, and Nalnish put himself between the bear and our cousin's young son. The bear's claws," she touched her own ribs. "They went deep. The wound never healed properly." Tom listened intently. "What kind of medicine were you looking for?" "There is a plant that grows only in this valley. My grandmother told me stories of it. The white settlers call it desert willow, but we know it by its true name. It has powerful healing properties for infected wounds." "And you came alone?" Ayana nodded. "My father is dead. My mother is caring for Nalnish. Our medicine man is very old, too old for such a journey. So I came." Tom felt a pang of admiration for this young woman's courage. To travel alone through hostile territory, knowing the risks, all for love of her brother. It reminded him of Sarah's selflessness, her willingness to help anyone in need, regardless of the cost to herself. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his gun as he called out, "Who is it?" "It's Doc Miller, Tom." "Open up." Tom recognized the voice of the town's physician, one of the few people in Copper Ridge who'd always shown fairness to everyone, regardless of their background. He opened the door to find the elderly doctor carrying his medical bag, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard there was some trouble," Doc Miller said, glancing toward the cell where Ayanna sat. "Thought maybe someone might need medical attention." "She's got some cuts and bruises," Tom said. "And nothing too serious, but I'd like to take a look anyway, if you don't mind." Doc Miller's tone was professional but kind. "Young lady, would you allow me to examine those injuries?" Ayanna looked to Tom, who nodded encouragingly. "Doc Miller's a good man. He's helped a lot of people in this town." As the doctor tended to Ayanna's wounds, Tom found himself thinking about the desert willow she'd mentioned. He'd seen the plant growing in the rocky areas outside town, but he'd never known its medicinal properties. Most of the settlers viewed the natural world as something to be conquered rather than learned from. "Sheriff," Doc Miller said quietly as he cleaned a cut on Ayanna's forehead, "I need to tell you something. Jake Morrison's been talking to people. He's claiming you've lost your mind, that you're a danger to the community." Tom's blood ran cold. "What kind of talking?" "The kind that ends with a new sheriff," Doc Miller replied grimly. "He's calling for a town meeting tomorrow. Says it's time for new leadership, someone who puts the safety of white folks first." Ayanna looked up from where the doctor was bandaging her wrist. "You should let me go," she said to Tom. "If I leave now, maybe they will forget their anger." "Like hell," Tom replied firmly. "Like you leave now, you'll be dead before you reach the desert. And even if you made it, what about the next Apache who comes to town, or the next Mexican trader, or anyone else who doesn't look like them or think like them?" Doc Miller finished his work and packed up his bag. "Tom's right," he said. "This isn't just about you, young lady. This is about what kind of town we're going to be." After the doctor left, Tom sat in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the town settling into evening. Somewhere out there, Jake Morrison was planning his next move. Tom had no illusions about what that meant. Jake had friends, men who shared his views about maintaining the racial hierarchy that kept people like him in power. "Sheriff," Ayanna said from her cell, "what will you do tomorrow?" Tom looked at the badge pinned to his vest, its silver surface tarnished from years of wear. "I honestly don't know," he admitted, "but I know what I won't do. I won't let them turn you into a symbol of their hate." As night fell over Copper Ridge, Tom made his preparations. He cleaned his guns, checked his ammunition, and wrote a letter to his sister back east. If things went badly tomorrow, he wanted someone to know why he'd made the choices he had. Outside, the desert wind howled through the streets, and Tom couldn't shake the feeling that it was carrying the scent of change and possibly blood. Dawn broke over Copper Ridge with an ominous stillness, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. Tom had spent the night in the chair beside Ayanna's cell, dozing fitfully with his hand resting on his gun. The young Apache woman had slept better than he had, though he'd seen her eyes open more than once during the night, alert and watchful. The sound of boots on the wooden sidewalk outside announced the arrival of the day's first visitors. Tom stood and straightened his vest, making sure his badge was clearly visible. Through the window, he could see Jake Morrison approaching with at least a dozen men behind him. Some carried rifles, others had their hands resting on their gun belts. This wasn't a casual visit. "Tom!" Jake called out, before he'd even reached the door. "We need to talk." Tom opened the door but didn't step outside. "Then talk." Jake looked past him toward the cell where Ayanna sat calmly on her cot. "We had a town meeting last night. Decided it's time for some changes around here." "What kind of changes?" "The kind where the sheriff remembers who he works for," said Pete Harris, pushing forward from the group. "You work for us, Tom, the people of this town, not for Apache squaws." Tom felt his jaw tighten. "I work for the law. The law says every person has rights, regardless of their race." "Whose law?" demanded Jake. "Some fancy lawyers back east who never had to worry about Apache raids, or the law of survival out here in the real world." Behind Jake, Tom recognized most of the faces. The banker, the shopkeeper, several ranchers and their hands. Men he'd shared drinks with, played cards with. Men whose children he'd helped find when they wandered off. Now they looked at him like he was a stranger. "The law that says a man's innocent until proven guilty," Tom replied. "The law that says we don't execute people based on fear and prejudice." "Fear?" Jake's voice rose. "My cousin's widow is raising 4 children alone because of Apache raiders. The Henderson Ranch lost 20 head of cattle last month. Mrs. Patterson's boy came home with an arrow in his shoulder. You call that fear?" Tom knew the incidents Jake mentioned were real. The conflict between the Apache and the settlers had been escalating for months, but he also knew that much of it could be traced back to men like Jake, who saw every Apache as an enemy and every interaction as a potential battle. "I call it a reason to find real solutions, not scapegoats," Tom said. Doc Miller appeared at the edge of the crowd, his medical bag in hand. "Gentlemen," he said in his calm, professional voice, "surely we can discuss this like civilized people." "Stay out of this, Doc," Jake warned. "This is between us and the sheriff." "Actually," came another voice from behind the crowd, "I think it concerns all of us." Tom was surprised to see Reverend Matthews pushing through the group. The minister was a small man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, but his presence commanded respect. He'd been the one to marry Tom and Sarah, and he'd spoken at her funeral with words that had brought comfort, even in the depths of grief. "Reverend," Jake said, clearly annoyed by the interruption, "this is a matter of public safety." "Is it?" Reverend Matthews asked. "Or is it a matter of Christian charity? I seem to recall a certain parable about a good Samaritan who helped someone from a different people, someone his own people considered an enemy." "Don't preach at us," Pete snarled. "This ain't Sunday school." "No," the Reverend agreed. "It's not. This is real life, where our actions have consequences for our souls as well as our safety." Tom felt a surge of gratitude for the minister's support, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The crowd was too angry, too afraid. They wanted blood, and they wanted it now. "Here's what's going to happen," Jake announced. "We're taking the Apache woman. We're going to escort her to the edge of town and make sure she understands she's not welcome here. Then we're going to have a discussion about whether this town needs a new sheriff." "No," Tom said simply. "No." Jake's hand moved to his gun. "You're outnumbered here, Tom. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Tom stepped fully outside now, closing the door behind him. He could feel Ayana's eyes on him through the window, could sense her tension. "How many of you are willing to kill me?" he asked, looking around at the faces in the crowd. The question hung in the air like smoke. Several men shifted uncomfortably. These weren't professional gunfighters or hardened criminals. They were farmers, shopkeepers, family men who'd let fear override their better judgment. "It doesn't have to come to that," said the banker, a thin man named Carlyle. "Just step aside, Tom. Let us handle this our way." "And what way is that, Mr. Carlyle? Are you going to shoot an unarmed woman? String her up from that oak tree. What exactly is your way?" The banker's face flushed red. "She's a spy, Tom, a scout for war parties." "Based on what evidence? A pouch of healing herbs?" "Based on the fact that she's Apache," Jake exploded. "That's evidence enough in my book." Tom nodded slowly. "Then your book is wrong." The confrontation might have escalated further, but a new sound interrupted them, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Everyone turned to see a cloud of dust rising from the desert road. As the riders drew closer, Tom could make out the blue uniforms of UAS cavalry. Captain William Hayes led the patrol into town, his weathered face grim beneath the brim of his campaign hat. Tom had dealt with Hayes before. The man was tough but fair, a career soldier who'd seen enough warfare to know the difference between necessary violence and senseless brutality. "Sheriff Mason," Captain Hayes called out as he dismounted. "We got reports of trouble in this area." Jake stepped forward before Tom could respond. "Captain, we're dealing with a dangerous Apache who was spying on our town. The sheriff here seems to have forgotten which side he's on." Captain Hayes looked from Jake to Tom, then toward the jail where Ayana's face was visible in the window. "That the Apache in question?" "Yes, sir," Tom replied. "Young woman named Ayana. She came to town looking for medicinal plants for her sick brother. And you believe her story?" Tom met the captain's steady gaze. "I've seen no evidence to contradict it. Her belongings contained only healing herbs, nothing that could be used for spying or warfare." Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Mind if I have a word with her?" "Not at all." As they walked toward the jail, Jake called out, "Captain, you need to know that this sheriff is compromised. He's putting Apache interests above the safety of American citizens." Captain Hayes stopped and turned around. "Mr. Morrison, isn't it? I remember you from the incident at Wilson Creek last month." Jake's face darkened. "That was self-defense. That was you and your boys shooting 2 Apache men who were trying to trade for medical supplies under a flag of truce. That incident triggered the raids you're so worried about." The crowd stirred uneasily. Many of them hadn't known the full story of what had sparked the recent violence. Tom felt a glimmer of hope as he saw doubt creeping into some of their faces. But Jake wasn't finished. "Are you saying we should just let them waltz into town whenever they please? Next thing you know, they'll be demanding the right to vote and own property." The ugly prejudice in Jake's voice was now plain for everyone to hear. Even some of his supporters looked uncomfortable with the venom in his words. Captain Hayes's expression hardened. "Mr. Morrison, I've spent 15 years fighting Apache, Comanche, and Sioux from Texas to Montana. I've seen what real war looks like. And I've also seen what happens when fear and hatred drive good people to do evil things. Right now, I'm more concerned about the latter." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Captain Hayes entered the jail to speak with Ayana. Tom waited outside with the crowd, watching Jake's face cycle through expressions of anger, frustration, and calculation. The would-be vigilante leader was clearly trying to figure out how to salvage his position now that the army had arrived. Through the window, Tom could see the captain speaking quietly with Ayana, his posture respectful rather than interrogational. The young Apache woman answered his questions with the same dignity she'd shown throughout her ordeal, her voice steady despite everything she'd endured. After 10 minutes, Captain Hayes emerged from the jail, his expression thoughtful. "Sheriff Mason, I'd like a word with you privately." They stepped away from the crowd, and Hayes lowered his voice. "That young woman in there is the daughter of Cochise's nephew. She's well known among the Apache as a healer and peacemaker. If anything happens to her, it won't just be a few cattle raids we're dealing with. It'll be all-out war." Tom felt his stomach drop. "She didn't tell me who her family was." "She wouldn't. Apache don't use their family connections for protection, but I've met her before at a peace council last spring. She was there translating for the elders, trying to prevent exactly the kind of bloodshed that's been happening lately." The captain's words hit Tom like a physical blow. He'd known Ayana was innocent, but he hadn't realized how high the stakes truly were. If Jake and his mob had succeeded in their plan, they would have sparked a war that could have consumed the entire territory. "What do you recommend, Captain?" "I recommend we get her safely back to her people, along with the medicine she came for. And I recommend this town finds a way to live in peace with its neighbors before it's too late." They rejoined the crowd, where Jake was still holding court, his voice rising as he tried to maintain his supporters' enthusiasm. "The army can't protect us forever," he was saying. "We need to take care of ourselves, make sure the Apache know they're not welcome here." "Mr. Morrison," Captain Hayes interrupted, "the young woman you wanted to harm is the daughter of one of the most respected peace chiefs in the territory. If you had succeeded in your plan, you would have signed the death warrant for every man, woman, and child in this valley." The color drained from Jake's face. Several of his supporters took unconscious steps backward, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what they'd almost done. "You're lying," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I don't lie about matters of war and peace," Hayes replied coldly. "I've seen too much death to find any sport in it." Doc Miller stepped forward. "Captain, the young woman mentioned she was looking for Desert Willow, for her brother's infected wound." "That's right," Hayes confirmed. "And I know exactly where to find it. There's a grove about 2 miles south of here, near the old mission ruins." Tom made his decision. "I'll escort her there myself, make sure she gets what she needs and safe passage back to her people." "The hell you will," Jake exploded. "You're not going anywhere with that Apache. We still have business to settle about your fitness as sheriff." "Actually," said a new voice, "I think we've settled that already." Everyone turned to see Mayor Whitman approaching, flanked by several of the town's more prominent citizens. The mayor was a portly man with silver hair and the kind of political instincts that had kept him in office for 8 years. Tom had always respected him, though they didn't always see eye to eye. "Mayor," Jake said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone, "we were just discussing the need for new leadership. Sheriff Mason has clearly lost sight of his priorities." Mayor Whitman looked around at the assembled crowd, his gaze lingering on the rifles and the angry faces. "What I see, Mr. Morrison, is a sheriff who prevented this town from committing an act that would have brought the entire Apache Nation down on our heads. I'd say his priorities are exactly where they should be." "But she's Apache," Pete protested. "They're all our enemies." "Son," said Reverend Matthews, "the Apache have been living in this land for thousands of years. We're the newcomers here. Maybe it's time we learned to be better neighbors." Tom felt a surge of pride in his community. Not everyone had been swept up in Jake's rhetoric. There were still people willing to stand for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. "Here's what's going to happen," Mayor Whitman announced. "Sheriff Mason is going to escort Miss Ayana to collect her medicine, and then he's going to see her safely on her way home. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." Jake's face was red with fury. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Duh! You're all making a mistake that'll get us killed." "The only mistake," Tom said quietly, "would be to let fear turn us into the very savages we claim to be fighting." An hour later, Tom rode out of Copper Ridge with Ayana on a borrowed horse beside him. The desert sun was climbing toward its zenith, but the air felt cleaner somehow, as if the storm had passed and left the world washed clean. "Why did you do it?" Ayana asked as they rode toward the mission ruins. "You could have kept your job, kept your standing in the community. All you had to do was look the other way." Tom was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Sarah, about the man he'd been and the man he wanted to be. "Because looking the other way is how good people become accomplices to evil. My wife taught me that before she died." They found the desert willow growing in a small canyon near the old mission, its delicate purple flowers bright against the red rocks. Ayana gathered what she needed with reverent care, her movements gentle and purposeful. Tom watched her work and thought about the different ways people could relate to the land, as conquerors or as partners. "Your brother will recover?" he asked. "With this medicine, yes. The willow bark will fight the infection, and the flowers will help the wound heal cleanly." As they prepared to part ways at the edge of Apache territory, Ayana turned to Tom with an expression of deep gratitude. "You risked everything for someone you didn't even know. Why?" Tom adjusted his badge, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as a responsibility. "Because that's what the law is supposed to mean. Justice for everyone, not just for people who look like us or think like us. Your people will not forget this," she said, "both those who supported you and those who opposed you. You have made enemies today." "Maybe," Tom acknowledged, "but I've also made it clear what I stand for. Sometimes that's more important than being popular." As he watched Ayana ride away into the desert, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of peace with his choices. He'd thrown down more than just his willingness to compromise with injustice. He'd thrown down his old self, the man who'd been slowly drowning in whiskey and self-pity. When he returned to Copper Ridge, he found a changed town. Jake Morrison and his hardcore supporters had left, heading for settlements where their brand of vigilante justice might find a more receptive audience. But most of the townspeople remained, and many came to shake his hand and thank him for his courage. Doc Miller summed it up best. "You didn't just save that girl's life, Tom. You saved our souls." That night, Tom sat on his porch watching the stars emerge in the desert sky. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like the man she'd fallen in love with, someone willing to stand up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. The badge on his chest caught the moonlight, and Tom smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his character, but tonight he was at peace with the knowledge that when the moment came, he'd chosen justice over convenience, courage over comfort. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and Tom thought he heard an echo of hope in its wild cry.